So we'll start ourselves off. We've talked about the career of Muhammad and then the first four caliphs. Abu Bakr died within 2 years, and then Umar, Uthman, and today we'll pick up with Ali. All were assassinated. What's that? The unification of the Arabic peoples under Muhammad was an incredible achievement. The creation of an army and then the spread, and also to overcome pagan polytheism. And in all honesty, Islam is a higher, purer religion than pagan polytheism. So he unites these people, he fashions them into a formidable army, and then he begins to spread. But Muhammad, like a lot of great leaders, and speaking personally, anybody divinely led doesn't really arrange for his successorship, very well. So we have, after they come out of Arabia, they go over to Parthia. That is the remnant of the Persians. So that is neither Jewish nor Christian culture. That's Zoroastrian. Then up to Armenia, then through Egypt, then through North Africa. As they go, of course, take the Holy Land. And that sets the stage for what we haven't got to yet, but in the class I'm teaching at the school, we're talking about the Crusades. Western Europe will try to take back the Holy Land and liberate the Byzantines from the Muslims from about 1100 A.D. for the next couple hundred years. There's several crusades, I think by some estimates 6. The first crusade was the most successful. And then after that, though, the Muslims regained control of the Holy Land until the insertion of the State of Israel post-World War II, and there has been no cessation of war ever since, and that's still in the news today. So one of the things that studying this material can help us do is understand, a lot of the students I deal with, somebody blew up something in the Middle East, but they don't know why. There's just another explosion. And sometimes it's Muslim against Muslim, and the kids don't understand. And then also, there's a lot of, here's a word we use a lot these days, disinformation. A lot of people don't really know how the Islamic religion got, who Muhammad is, what he did in his lifetime. And between people who want to demonize Muhammad and those who want to say Islam is a religion of peace, it's more complicated. It's just a little more complicated than those two extremes. Muhammad and the Islamic faith is not a religion of military peace. It was based in world conquest from the beginning, and it continues to do that. Though, unlike, say, Jesus of Nazareth, that's not a late-in-time confusion. That began from the beginning. On the other hand, Muhammad was capable of dealing justly and gently with the conquered. Sometimes he didn't. We have cases where, as we saw, he personally presided over the beheading of a large number of Jews of a particular tribe. And he certainly was very harsh on the Persians. But there are centuries that show that for conquered peoples, as long as they have class citizenship, they lived fairly at peace. So it's just a little bit more of a complicated scenario than the one that we're sometimes given. Today, picking up on page 21, with the assassination of Ali. And once we're through Ali, we're really through the people who personally knew Muhammad himself. That is true even in the New Testament. We have a season where you're dealing with Jesus. Peter knew Jesus, James and John. But then you reach kind of the next generation. And in Christian history, we call those the apostolic fathers. They may not have known Jesus personally, but they knew men who knew Jesus. And I taught a lesson a long time ago called Men Who Knew the Apostles. But Papias, we talked about, of Hierapolis, knew the Apostle John, even though he didn't know Jesus himself. And certainly Clement of Rome was familiar with Paul, but he had never met Jesus personally. Polycarp is more well known because he died as a martyr, and he was a disciple of John, though Polycarp had never met Jesus personally, to any of our knowledge. And Ignatius is another. So we're kind of entering today for a title you could call the second generation of Islam. People who were Muslims but hadn't actually met Muhammad himself. So I'm picking up on page 21, but before I do that, I want to see if there's any kind of questions or comments on the front end there. 15 minutes, that's a quarter of the time.
Actually, this is a more modern question, I guess, but is it correct that if the Muslims lose a territory, such as they at one time lost the Holy Land and got it back, but now the state of Israel, do they have some sort of obligation to bring that space back under their regime?
Within conservative Islam, yes, because they also have an idea of divine providence, same as Christians do. And so, but their idea of divine providence is a little bit more materialistic than that of Christians. And so, in some ways, it resembles that of the ancient world, and in some cases, that of Israel. If we'll take a story from 1 Samuel. If the Philistines capture the Ark of the Covenant, it's not because Yahweh is not sufficiently powerful. It's because the people of Israel have. That makes sense. And so there's shame that accompanies it, and usually in the wake of that shame is an upsurge of zeal to retake. And that's a very, very ancient idea you find in all ancient civilizations, Babylon, Egypt, Canaan, and so forth. Whoever's gods are the most powerful win. And that's pretty a basic idea. If you're stronger, you win. That's one of the reasons why Paul repeatedly says that the cross is an offense to Jews. Because the cross, for many Jews, is a sign that Yahweh has failed. Now, it's not if you believe in the resurrection. But then that's sort of the second punch. But the idea of a crucified God, I don't think today we've been so Christianized we can quite appreciate how incredibly offensive that was to first century people. God always wins. And so if your God is crucified, some of you may have even seen a little bit of graffiti from first century Rome that depicts a person on a cross with the head of a mule. And then there is a little person worshiping the mule, and it says, so-and-so worships his God. That's a pretty sharp insult. It's basically saying, so worships a failed God. So I think the Muslim religion draws upon that older ethos. If you fail in the this worldly, you're a failure. older. I think it's still very much enforced today. People still think that way. Anyways. So on page 21, I'll talk about the Umayyad dynasty from 661 to 750. So we got about, 100 years to cover here. And then a little later, I'm going to talk about the Abbasids, 750 to 945. So if I behave myself, we'll get through the whole early Middle Ages pretty much. Ali is murdered. He's struck down while praying in a mosque. And that mosque becomes the city where Shiite Islam continues to operate out of. So the Shiites and the Sunnis are definitely at odds now. And this is really the formal split between Shiite and Sunni, because the murder of Ali shows that the nation is divided, and the Shiites believe that they're in the right.
Where is Najaf?
If I'm guessing, it's in what today is considered Iran. Is it in? It's very Iraq. Where at in Iraq? Got a phone here. Yeah, it's got to be between Iraq and Iran. Okay. Now, Baghdad, we'll talk about here in a little bit. Baghdad's going to be founded by the Abbasid dynasty and will become a lavish, important city in the early Middle Ages. There's a struggle for the rule of the nation between Ali's older son, Hassan, and Muawiyah, who is the next in line from the Sunni. Hassan chooses to stand down, so that ends the conflict. But there's discussion as to why. Some say he was paid off and decided to retire from public office. That's what the Sunnis say. So you've got two stories. The Sunnis say he stood down and retired. Others say he just wanted to avoid bloodshed, but still wanted to resume public office. Those are the Shiites. So why he stood down is perverted. So I guess you could compare that with, was the election stolen or wasn't it? They still agree. Both say that the other traitors, and it's like, when it comes to, nobody knows, and so it becomes almost a moral issue what side of that fence you stand on. In either case, he finished out his days in luxury and sensuality at the city of Medina. He took upward of 60 wives, upward of 300 concubines. So, he did not end his life lonesome. We'll say that. Many of his followers still regard him as the second imam, particularly among the Shia. They think he was the legitimate one, but he got stepped over. So it goes back to the caliphate of the Umayyads, and so I'll put them on the board here. So in some ways, a pivotal figure where the Sunni and the Shiite split. But it's just a blip on a map. For the most part, the Sunni have largely the majority in power. So we'll put the Umayyad dynasty here, and I'll put the dates. And we'll follow them through. And the dates here, 661 to about 750. Muawiyah ruled from 661 to 680. Hassan, who was the other contender, was poisoned by one of his wives. Guys, check your food. Check your food. Have the kids eat it first. Hassan was Ali's Shiite successor who stepped down and took 30 wives and hundreds of concubines. And those are bad odds, incidentally. And so one of them poisoned him. Muawiyah was successful caliph, and so I'll put him on the board, 661 to 680. We'll kind of get a chronology. There's so many names and so many events, especially when you study ancient and medieval history, that you sort of get lost in the details. So what I do often when I teach here and at the school is I try to line everything up kind of fact-based. Then we try to pull it all together and figure out what are the important facts. Because not everything's equally important, but you do kind of need a chronology to follow. But he's more political than religious. He and his family only converted to Islam when it became expedient to do so. That's important. That continues into the modern period. Many politicians who are in charge of Islamic nations and states are not themselves very religious people. And so a conflict occurs between the politician and the Muslim people at the bottom and their local religious leaders between those two things. And a lot of people don't in the West always understand that. Well, we can probably understand that in our own way. Maybe people in other countries think that Joe Biden is a very pious Catholic. But I don't think most of you think that. And so they might say, well, I don't understand why they have a problem with this president. I mean, after all, he's a God-fearing Roman Catholic. So the same thing definitely happens in Muslim countries, certainly quite a lot in the 20th century, where certain men who come into control, political control of these societies, they claim to speak for Islam. But that doesn't mean everybody below them believe that they speak for Islam. And so we'll have to bear that in mind. You remember that when Hitler was in Germany, announced Chancellor and Protector of the Christian Faith in the 1930s. That sounds odd to our ears, but that was his official title, Protector of the Christian Faith. Okay, right. He might be a lot of things, but Protector of the Christian Faith is not one of them. Okay. So one thing to bear in mind as we look at the Umayyad dynasty and as we go through these leaders is we have to admit to them the same conflict between politics and religion that we ourselves experience. That's important. Muawiyah was resented by the Shiites. The Kharijites, who we mentioned last week, were the ones that opposed him. And I'll put them back up here. The Kharijites were kind of an obscure branch of Islam, but they were really the first terrorists. In the sense that they operated outside of the law, they tried to assassinate the leaders, and they waged war against other Muslims. And that spirit will spread. Now we have an capital at Damascus. That will become very important. The capital city is at Damascus in the Holy Land, northern part. So, in other words, the center of Islam has moved from the Middle East. That's maybe the proper way of thinking about it. I'm going to put Damascus up here. So even though people have to make a pilgrimage once in their lifetime to Mecca, you can see that the center of gravity of Islam has moved farther north to Damascus. And he was the first to begin imitating the patterns of the Byzantine Empire. At the time, in Byzantium, the architecture of their churches, these sort of domed buildings, a lot of people today, whenever they see a domed building, assume that it's Muslim. That's really Greek Byzantine architecture that the Muslims took over. Another common practice was the extreme veiling of women. That was taken over by Muslims. He extended into Africa, into Persia. He conquered Cyprus, this island here, and then further west into Rhodes, approaching Greece. He was the first to lay siege to Constantinople. And this is an important event because Constantinople did not fall. And that was the first city where the Muslim expansion hit a wall. Here, no further. And that would last until does anybody know the date? 1453. Hey, there it is, 1453. Mid-15th century. I didn't have it off the top of my head. 1450s, 1453. So if you think about it, a little less than 1,000 years. The Muslims will never invade Eastern Europe. Constantinople will remain. And that's important because that allows Greek Orthodoxy and Roman Catholicism, and by extension, Protestantism, to flourish in Western Europe. If they had been conquered when Muawiyah attacked Constantinople, history would have been different. History would have been very, very different than it is today. So Constantinople is this city right here. And technically it's in sort of northeastern Greece. In between Constantinople and Asia Minor is this little inlet of water, sometimes called the Hellespont. On the other side of the Hellespont is the city of Troy, where the Greeks and the Trojans fought. And so since ancient times, this little spot here has been viewed as border territory between the Middle East and Western civilization. And it's been the site of many, many wars, going back to the Trojan War, Homer's day, and here with the Muslims and the Byzantines. So that's a very, very big event. 674 to 678, they were not able to take the city. And that's really the first wall that the Muslim expansion hit in the east. They'll also hit a wall in the west, and that will protect Western civilization from the intrusion of Islam.
Just a bigger army?
It's a combination of factors. Some of it's a bigger army. Some of it is greater technological ability. Some of it is concentration, sort of like the game Risk. If you look at this map, this red line signifies all of the Byzantine Empire. Pretty much all of it gets taken by the Muslims, because the Byzantines had spread their forces very diffusely over a wide area. But that's their capital city, and they're going to defend that. They're not going to let the Muslims invade their capital. Now, if you get an older version of Martin Luther's hymn, "A Mighty Fortress is Our God," there are verses that refer to the Muslim Turks post the invasion of Constantinople that are not considered, shall we say, edifying for the modern singer. But they're there, so you can find them. It's interesting how the old hymns sort of get tweaked throughout the centuries. In the time we get them, there's something a little bit more eternal about them, which is good. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. But you do realize if you study them that they were written by men in their own time, facing issues in their own time. Anyways, very, very interesting. Muawiyah is the first to try to establish a dynasty. That's a big deal. So now he wants the authority of Muhammad to pass through his offspring to the next generation. So I'll write that here. Damascus, Constantinople, and he does try to establish a dynasty. His opponents had little doubt that the increasing corruption of the caliphate was the reason why the nation had fallen out of divine favor. In other words, why hadn't they beaten the Byzantines? Well, the popular opinion was that they were corrupt. The Sunni gave the rule of the nation to his son, Yazid. He will be the 6th caliph. And I'll put a little bracket around those two. The Shia, Ali's second son, Hussein. So Ali had 2 sons, Hassan and Hussein. Still very popular names. He attempted to meet up with his support base at Kufa. He and his men were slaughtered at a town south of Baghdad. And so Hassan retires, and Hussein, when he tries to get involved, he too is assassinated. So there's just this incredible ongoing power. What's that?
Wasn't Hassan also murdered?
Well, he was, though, by one of his wives. So while I'm doing red here, I don't know. It's looking more and more like I don't even want to try to run things because it's like signing your own death warrant. There was an old joke about Herod the Great. You know, he killed all the little babies in Bethlehem when Jesus was born. We learned from Josephus he killed a lot of other people too, including many of his wives and children, because he was afraid they were trying to steal the kingship from him. And so there was an old Jewish joke that it would be better to be Herod's pig than his wife, because since he observed the pig would be he wouldn't actually kill it.
That was actually by by Caesar. Augustus Caesar said that.
Oh, was it Caesar Augustus that said that? Yeah.
Caesar said it would be better to be Herod's pig than his son. He killed 3 of his sons.
Yeah. Well, and he had several wives, and he had several of them murdered as well.
Killed them and starved one of their mothers to death.
So many people think that the slaughter of the children of Bethlehem, oh, that could never have happened. But once you learn about Herod's life, no, it could have happened. he was a brutal and paranoid ruler. Paranoid.
He changed 6 times in the last few years of his life.
He just didn't wanted, some of these ancient kings, getting power and then maintaining power is a violent, bloody process. And then once you gain power, you sort of sweep away all the evidence as best as you can of what actually occurred there. And we see that happening. Muhammad died of natural causes, but this is an ongoing struggle for power. And so the murderous struggle for power in the Islamic community is not a latent time development. It's been there since the beginning. And it's not any worse. Again, it's not any worse than any other civilization or kingdom. It happens in most ancient civilizations and kingdoms. It just jars that much more with the claim to divinity that the Islamic religion claims. Hussein and his men became objects of veneration within the Shiite Islam. Saddam Hussein, the name Hussein there is important. It's of cultural importance. And many other rulers before him took the name. Hussein becomes identical with the righteous sufferer, the right ruler who is. They add a new sacred time to Ramadan. During the month of Muharram, dramas of the battle with the death of Hussein are reenacted, and the people engage in crying, beating their chest, cutting themselves. So weeping over the death of Hussein becomes a staple within Shiite Islam. And they also add a new sacred place. So in addition to the Kaaba in Mecca, we have the tomb of Hussein in Karbala. Pilgrimage to the tomb of Hussein at Karbala is said to merit the value of 1,000 pilgrimages to the Kaaba in Mecca. So if the Sunni make one trip to the Kaaba, that's one. If the Shiite make one trip to Karbala, that's worth 1,000. That's a pretty good deal. And so you're in. But you can see that the difference between the Shiite and the Sunni is becoming more bitter. It's becoming bitter, and the religious doctrines that are surrounding it are entrenching people in a sort of state of opposition to the other side. So last week we talked about the initial split, but at this point, this split will never be gotten over. They will fight until the end of all time over this issue. The martyrdom of Hussein was followed by a second civil war. Yazid was opposed by a steward of the Imam named Abdullah ibn az-Zubayr. The struggle over who would rule the nation was accompanied by arguments over who was divinely appointed to serve as the next rightly guided Imam, and also accompanied by the expectation that whoever it was would abolish oppression and restore justice. Accordingly, this as yet unnamed individual acquired the messianic title Mahdi, or rightly guided one. So at this point, there comes a title for an individual who does not yet exist, known as the Mahdi. The Mahdi is the rightly guided one. And I call this a kind of messianic title because in some ways it is. With all of the power struggle and the bloodshed going on in the nation, there's going to be someone's going to say, if Allah is indeed the providential God, then somebody's going to come and straighten this out. And so that will be, within Islam, the Mahdi. In the days ahead, the belief in an ideal ruler who would one day unite the nation of Islam. So that's what he does. He will unite, and the nation of Islam is called the Ummah. He will unite the Ummah. In some ways, it's interesting because you see a lot of Jewish and Christian elements happening later in history, but then they kind of evolve out of the internal conflicts of Islam and create almost what I would regard as sort of a parody of Christianity going on at the same time. He's going to, the Shiites as well as the Sunni, both believe in the Mahdi, but there's a Shiite Mahdi and there's a Sunni Mahdi. So I have a couple footnotes here. The idea of the Mahdi started with the Shiites. Even though a false ruler was in charge of the nation, they believed that the true ruler was living in hiding and would soon be revealed. Specific historic situation that would later morph into a general religious doctrine called occultation. So, he's out there. He exists. He just hasn't revealed himself yet, and he's waiting for his moment. The total number of imams believed to lay between Ali, who was the first, the last, the Mahdi, gives its name to the various historic sects of Shiite Islam. For example, there are historically extinct groups like the Fourers and the Fivers. So we have apocalyptic predictors. Some said it's going to be 4. Some said it's going to be 5. At present, the smallest Shiite denomination is made up of the Seveners. 7 is a good number. The largest Shiite denomination is made up of the Twelvers. So at present, among Shiites, there are Seveners and Twelvers, and they keep count differently. So they all keep score, but they don't keep score with the same rules. The 12th Imam is made up from the 9th century man named Muhammad ibn al-Hassan.
Is that the 9th century in the the Muslim calendar?
That's in the Western calendar. So all of the dates here I keep in the Western calendar.
Okay.
At present, he remains in occultation. That means he exists, but he's hidden. He nevertheless exercises power through his earthly stewards until the day of his revelation. His earthly stewards are called the Ayatollah, signs of Allah. So the Ayatollah is an earthly steward. For Christians, he's a John the Baptist. He's preparing the way for the coming of the Mahdi. Now, the Ayatollah was just in power when I was a kid. I just heard about him on the news in Iran and stuff. I didn't know anything. I thought that was like his name or something. Yeah, his first name was Ayatollah, and his last name was Khomeini. And I definitely have some students that think Jesus' last name is Christ. It's just like, no, that's not really how it works. But, that's just how they're used to thinking about it. So this is still a very, very much a live issue. And so what a lot of Westerners did not understand is that Ayatollah Khomeini, the energy that he created within Iran, within the Islamic community, is apocalyptic. That there's something he's on the end of all things with the person who's going to unite the whole Islamic community once and for all. And you have to understand that, I think, in order to appreciate the zeal with which his followers backed him up. And that was in the 1970s, I think. I don't know the precise date. 70s. What's that? In the United States? I have no idea.
I think it's the Sunnis.
By and large, the Sunnis is the best bet anywhere. In Los Angeles, California? Sunnis have an easier time adapting to democratic culture than Shiites.
Shiites are the conservative ones? The
No, the Shiites are the radicals.
Really conservative.
Well, I guess it depends on what you mean by conservative and radical, but
The burqas and everything else.
Yes.
yeah, I guess conservative in the sense that you mean, yes.
I suspect that they're secret readers of the,
What's that?
I suspect that they're all secret readers of scriptures, because they seem to be robbing different things, like sevens and 12s.
Yes, Islam is very much heavily influenced by the Old Testament.
Even the Mahdi and what happens before the Mahdi comes, it's like you could almost be taking it right out of Revelation. All the things that, it's like they're robbing the Christians and just putting their own twist on it.
Yeah, me as a pastor and as a Christian, I would say Islam is simply the most intricate and successful heresy ever been perpetrated, because all of its ideas from Judaism. Now, no Muslim, if they were here, we could have, he would argue with me, if I said that. But I always thought it was appropriate that their symbol was the moon, because it borrows its light from the sun. And I don't think that's what was ever intended, but all of these ideas are in the Old Testament and in the New Testament. The whole idea of jihad, really Israel's war against Canaan expanded on a global scale. Now, Israel's war against Canaan was a very, very violent war, but it had a definite limit. Once they reached the territory promised to Abraham, they were to stop. And that, of course, sets the stage for the story of Christianity. The purpose of Israel is not to conquer the world. That's a very Christian view. So then I would have to engage in a dispute with a Muslim person about that. But this is does everybody see how this is a very messianic idea? That there's a future ruler who's going to come and going to bring everything together, and that's the Mahdi.
Pastor Chad, the recent Islamic movements, ISIS and things like that, there's been a renewed interest in the Mahdi. And there's many who really believe that he's in hiding.
Yes?
They can kind of unite Iraq and Iran, and maybe part of Syria, that he will come out of hiding.
We haven't got to that lesson yet. It's a little bit later. But within ISIS, there's definitely is an energetic belief that the Mahdi is alive, has been born, is in the world, and is waiting for the prepare ye the way of the Mahdi, is what's going on. And so when Westerners come in with their assemblies and they're up against something a little bit that is out of their depth, religiously speaking.
It's scary too, because the whole idea of the Mahdi is he's going to unite Islam under one caliphate and then fight off the infidels. We're defined as the infidels.
Yes, we're the infidels. If anything, Islam, I think, is a fairly solid disproof of Marxist philosophy, that the only thing that drives people is material wealth. That's just so false. And it's false throughout all levels of history, that people are fundamentally materialistic and driven by wealth and inequality. But a large number of Westerners are embracing that view, and now they're coming into contact with a force that doesn't believe in that at all. And they don't know what to do with it. It's like, we give money, if we give power, if we give rights to this particular group, it's going to solve all of our problems. And I'm just thinking as a Christian about this, and I think, no, I don't think so. Even as a Christian, that's not what drives me. And so if someone else says, well, you're just driven, I think, well, I'm an idiot. I'm a pastor and a teacher is that I follow, you know. That's always been my drive. It's like, well, I can't I can't speak for others, but I can say for myself, that has not been my drive. You know, that hasn't been what's driven me in life. And well, I identify with some of this, at least that I identify with a religious sentiment behind it, even if I don't agree with it. Yeah.
Fun thing to mention too, for people, there's a movie, I think it's early 60s, called Cartoon. Charlton Heston actually meets the body.
No, I wasn't familiar with that.
What the body must look like, he's on film.
Laurence Olivier, I believe, plays the body.
Yeah.
Laurence Olivier plays the Mahdi?
A devilish Laurence Olivier.
I've not, what is this called?
The cartoon.
Cartoon.
Charlton Heston.
I've not seen it. I like old
It's in color, so it's not.
Well, he plays.
Technicolor, I bet.
He plays General Gordon, was
Okay.
the figure, and he has a Bible on his desk, as I recall. He was a Christian. So you have the class that was kind of, you know,
I'm going to be up late tonight. You guys ruined it for me.
it's a long movie.
Becky's going to say, what are you doing? It'll be 3 a.m. I'm saying,
It's like
It has an
three.
intermission.
It's one of those long epic movies.
Yeah, it's like Lawrence of Arabia, it has like an intermission.
Charlton Heston meets the Mahdi.
Well, a Christian general meets the Mahdi.
By the way, not to give anything away, but Heston versus the body, you know who's going to win that war.
Charlton Heston never loses.
Yeah, it's like Arnold Schwarzenegger.
No.
No,
Yeah.
not a chance.
Yeah.
Not a fair fight.
Yeah. I'm intrigued.
You're going to do this.
I thought it was a fairly interesting movie.
What's a cartoon? Now, I've heard that title, but I've never watched it.
It was a siege, I believe, a Muslim besieging cartoon, wasn't that?
Yeah,
It surrounded the city,
besieging,
and
yeah.
Gordon, played by Charlton Heston, is in charge of the city.
Okay.
So they meet in the tent and they have.
I always thought cartoon was the name of Waltz's horse from Godfather 1, but I'll watch this movie.
They have a philosophical discussion.
Okay. Well, I'll go for that. You guys have given me some homework. Okay. Top page 23. I will say that the Sunni Mahdi, the Sunni also believe in the Mahdi. They don't believe he's in hiding, but they don't believe he's yet been born. When he comes, he will be a wise and just ruler who will restore unity. So broadly speaking, I would say that for the Sunni, we'll know the Mahdi when he comes. So they have a kind of, he's going to prove himself, which is not as amenable to zealous activity underground as it is for the Shiite. Top page 23, the Messianic ruler had not yet arrived, unfortunately. The hope of a future kingdom was born among the Shiites. The reality of a present earthly kingdom was established among the Sunnis. After the end of the Second Civil War, the old imperial order was reestablished under Caliph Abd al-Malik. These are very Semitic sounding names. Abd al-Malik is servant of the king. Yeah. Over the next half century, he and his descendants ruled as leaders, office holders. They governed from a rich, well-guarded palace. Their public lives consisted of receptions and deliberations. Their private lives were spent hunting, literature, music, wine, and, of course, girls. The military was no longer a band of relatives with shared interest in vengeance or plunder, but servants of the government. Salaries were furnished by taxpayers. First-class citizenry was made up of Arabs, so they continued to focus on that. But they were increasingly outnumbered by second-class citizens from Syria, Egypt, Persia, Africa, Turkey, India, China, and unattached people, the Gypsies. In the absence of ethnic identity, an effort was made to create a cultural unity. The first step was to make the Arabic language the language of international administration. So I'm going to put our ruler here, Abd al-Malik, and probably one of the most important things that he does 5 years later, so this is after the Civil War, is to make Arabic the international language. Because now that Islam has spread over ethnic groups, what language are they going to speak? So Arabic has to become what we call the lingua franca. And after Greek, Arabic and Latin become languages of the Middle Ages. And Arabic is still spoken in the world today. Like English, it's become incredibly complex. So people talk about how hard it is to learn English because it has such a long history. But Arabic is the same way. Artists of the period use classical techniques to produce ornate forms of decoration, calligraphy, geometry, foliage patterns. We took a trip to the DIA 2 days ago with my students. We took a trip. And my medieval history students, we went to the Islamic art section, and it just bored the socks off of them because it was just books with calligraphy, and there were no statues or depictions of anything. It was just highly illuminated books.
Carpets and the pottery.
Yeah. And so they refrained on the basis largely of the second commandment in the law of Moses from depicting animals or humans or physical objects. So it was all calligraphy. The usual object of such adornment being ceramics, books, and architecture, most notably the Dome of the Rock, 691. So many of you have seen the Dome of the Rock. We talked about it, I think, last week, but it occurs during this ruler's administration, 691, to replace the old mosque that was originally built over Solomon's temple in Jerusalem. The purpose is to serve as a visible demonstration of Islam's supremacy over Judaism and Christianity, so it's a very important building. There's a large rock, the summit of Mount Zion, site where Isaac bound and the temple was built, and also where Muhammad is said to have ascended into heaven. That's called sometimes the foundation stone, and has been a place of pilgrimage. Jews will still visit the wall Yom Kippur by the Temple Mount. You see pictures of them sometimes where they pray. Beneath the stone is a large cavern known as the Well of the Souls. Which, of course, when I grew up, I thought had something to do with Indiana Jones from right into the Lost Ark, but, it's down there. And that was the traditional resting place of the Ark of the Covenant. As the Muslims went west into Spain, they became known as Moors. East, they reach India and China, where they're known as Saracens. But they still do not penetrate into Western Europe. Now, I do mention here the Byzantine Emperor Leo III believed that divine providence, the reason why the Byzantines were being attacked by the Muslims was a judgment of God. In order to restore his administration, this is footnote 30, to divine favor, he instituted two religious reforms. First, he sought to forcibly baptize dissidents within his community, mostly Jews and Montanists, who still existed at that time, interestingly. We'll talk about them. So, mostly forcible baptism of Jews. And second, he forbade the veneration of icons. He believed one of the reasons why the Muslims were having such success is their scrupulous observance of the second commandment. The last and greatest of the early church fathers, John of Damascus, belongs to this time period. He lived in the capital of the Muslim Empire. He wrote the first. John of Damascus wrote the first apologetic against the Muslim religion, which can still be read. So he's a Christian living in the Holy Land in the city of Damascus under Muslim rule. And he's really considered the last of the early church fathers before the building of the great universities of Western Europe and what we call sort of scholastic theologians. We've got a conversation between a Saracen and a Christian. That's a good work. And another one called Apologetic Treatise Against Those Decrying Holy Images. He's widely regarded as a theologian between Augustine and Aquinas. So if you haven't heard John of Damascus, he's a pretty important character. And a lot of people don't know that he exists. Most people have heard of St. Augustine. Most people have heard of St. Thomas Aquinas. But I would place John of Damascus between the two. He's probably the most significant Christian theologian of the early Middle Ages. His systematic work is called The Fount of Wisdom. And it's quoted quite a bit by Thomas Aquinas and later theologians. And it was very important in the Seventh Ecumenical Council, which had to do with whether we are permitted to venerate images. A number of different things to deal with, but one was veneration. And that's actually still a big issue in the church today. If I... Oh my goodness, I'm past time. So next week, I'm going to have to deal with the Abbasid dynasty, and I didn't get as far as I thought that I would, but I'll give you a new lesson. One thing that I'll say, though, just to kind of close out today, if someone raises a flag and I cover my heart with my hand and look to the flag, I'm showing a high degree of respect or veneration for the flag. One of the issues in the Seventh Council was whether Christians should venerate saints, whether they should venerate an icon like the cross or other symbols of religious devotion. And so that became a very, very big issue as Christendom came into touch with Islam, because the Muslims, they were very careful about that. And so Christians began to become very, very scrupulous. And that does eventually create a difference between the Eastern and the Western Church. In the Eastern Church, they do not make statues. They might have two-dimensional pictures of people with a halo over the head. And it's not really the peace sign, but they're... and in the Western Church, they continue to use statuary. So what should Christians venerate? Should they venerate anything at all other than Christ? Can they venerate the cross? Can they make the sign of the cross? Can they bow the knee? Which I think are important questions, since in America, at least, we don't even balk at the idea of covering our hearts when the flag is raised. But we have scruples about other things, and it's a legitimate question. So
were these all the different questions that the Seventh Ecumenical Council addressed?
Yes, it had to do with veneration of icons, and it was Islam that brought the issue to the... I'll stand. I got to let you go because I am way past time.